everybody, and welcome to this session of the Clarivate webinar on manuscript writing for publishing in high impact journals, the do's and don'ts of it. Thank you for joining us, and we will get started in a moment. A small housekeeping announcement. Please keep your questions limited to actual queries during the session, and please put those questions in the question and answer or the chat functionalities of this WebEx. So hear us if you are joining in from a mobile device. So a small request, if you are joining in from a mobile device and you cannot hear us, we request you to switch on to a computer system so that the audio is audible. The agenda of today's session is research and publishing in academia. We'll talk about the structure of a scientific paper and how we do an effective literature review. We'll talk about the different aspects of the scientific paper, and we'll also talk about choosing the appropriate journal for publishing, the role of journal citation reports. There are several kinds of academic writing. They could be public, they could be ones which are not in the public domain. So typically, you have scientific writing that is classified into peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed categories. So when we talk about peer-reviewed categories, it means that your writing has been looked at, the results, the content in that publication has been reviewed by a panel of experts in the field, and after going through a thorough vetting and review process, it has been made accessible to the public. So anything which comes in journals, anything which is published in scientific journals, research journals, under the ambit of public peer-reviewed publications. So that could mean original research papers, they could be conference reports, reviews, which are basically a critical synthesis or analysis of what has been done in the field. Now, there could also be peer-reviewed publications which are not made public to everybody. For example, when you grant applications, they are again reviewed by a scientific body, but these are not in the public domain. At the same time, there are non-peer reviewed publications too. So these could be theses and dissertations. So theses and dissertations, though they are reviewed by a committee, they do not come under the ambit of the formal journal peer review process. You could have web pages or editorial comments. It could be book chapters. Book chapters typically are invitations by experts to write on a topic, and they are not subjected to the step-by-step peer review as we see in journal articles. So these are the type of academic writings that you will come across. Now let us try to understand the characteristics of a scientific paper or scientific writing. What sets it apart from other kinds of technical writing? So when we talk about scientific writing, it is a technical form of writing, right? That communicates scientific information to other people or other scientists and researchers in a document, proceedings paper in a written form, right? And there are certain features of scientific writing. The first thing is clarity and precision. Scientific writing relies on unequivocal accuracy, as the mission of a scientific document is to provide relevant and factual information to the scientific community. It should reach the audience with the same meaning it has had. So it has to have objectivity. A scientific paper or a research paper takes an objective viewpoint towards the subject, meaning that it does not typically offer an author's opinion. Instead, the author focuses on presenting and analyzing facts. In some cases in social sciences, if you're writing about the perspective, you do become subjective, but even the subjectivity in writing in certain cases needs to be bolstered by, analysis, by literature, by citations. That where how did you come to that perspective? How did you come to that particular viewpoint? But typically, a scientific paper generally takes an objective viewpoint towards the subject. Thoroughness. Scientific writers offer as many details in their publication as necessary for the readers to thoroughly understand the subject, and the language has to be exact. A scientific paper minimizes the use of figurative or imaginative language. When we talk about clarity, how does it how do you increase the clarity? The writer typically clarifies the meanings of any uncommon terms. We summarize the results of the writing in a way that anyone can understand. Another thing which typifies a scientific paper is its conciseness. When you are writing a scientific paper, try not to get too involved into jargon. You will see a lot of scientific writing that overtly relies on jargon. But when you do that or you take that approach, you are at the risk of alienating many of your readers, because then they are not really, into the publication. They are not really reading that publication and understanding, enjoying it, or sometimes the readability of the paper really goes down. It has to be simple. I have already said that a publication needs to be simple, and it should also have a lot of illustration. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, and it is imperative that as a researcher you make use of good figures and tables. Whenever we start a scientific paper, we also start with the first thing is trying to understand the field, right? It is very important that you understand a field before you embark on writing a manuscript. So when you say that you want to understand the field, we are talking about literature review. A good literature review demonstrates that you know the field and justifies the reason for your research. So, why are you doing the particular project? What the work that has been done till date, is it not addressing the needs? It also allows you to establish your theoretical framework and methodological focus. Literature review. So let us try to understand what we mean by a literature review. It is a survey of scholarly sources that provide an overview of a particular topic, right? And the basic components of a literature review includes a description of the publication and a summary of the publication's main point. So even if you are right doing a literature review for collecting background information to justify your project, when you're reading every particular paper, make sure that you understand the publication, understand the gaps in research, and what is the difference between a literature review and an annotated bibliography. An annotated bibliography is a list of references with a summary of the content and the publication's relationship to your research question. When you write an actual literature review, uh, it tries to understand how each of these publications contributes to the discussion and understanding of the topic. The literature review process, we start with problem formulation, clearly defining which topic or field is being examined and what its component issues are. We all try to also understand the literature search by finding materials relevant to the subject being explored and keeping up to date during the review process. So that now, when you do a literature review, it is very, very important that you go about doing it in a systematic way. You have to understand what exactly is the problem or the field in which it's being examined and find the materials relevant to the subject. Now, this is good scientific, this is also important for writing a review paper per se. Okay, so when you're writing a review paper, you are trying to understand. So let us say you are writing a review paper on electric vehicles. So the point that is, uh, what has been, what is known till date. Now, electric vehicles is a very vast topic. A good literature review on this subject probably would be something more specific, one component of this vast field. So maybe in electric vehicles, you can try to understand how they have contributed, to reducing pollution or making transport efficient in overcrowded cities in a certain geography. So you are actually working, or you're actually writing on a very, very specific area. So that also makes your literature review specific. It gives your reader more perspective on one particular topic. So another small tip, when you are trying to address a topic, make sure that the topic is in, and you're writing a review paper or a literature review on that, make sure that your literature review, the problem that you have chosen to review, is not too broad, so as to not be just a laundry list of papers. And also you can add some more, critical analysis of the research. If you are choosing a very broad topic to write a literature review on, you run the risk of writing about too much but really telling your audience very less. When you are doing a literature search, try to make sure that you do it in a systematic way by using certain, so there are tools like the Web of Science where you can put in many, there are different filters. You can search for very specific topics. You can make sure that you create a bibliography and understand. This helps not only in writing a literature review, but even if you're doing a literature search for your scientific manuscript or for your project, it allows you to create a systematic a systematic folder, or a very, well arranged list of references that you can always come back and, you can retrieve them at a later point. You can understand how each of these publications has contributed to that field. It keeps your work very well arranged. Purpose of a literature review: you demonstrate familiarity with topic and scholarly context. Now, even when you are writing an original research manuscript where you have original experimental, or let's say survey data, or any kind of, primary data, original primary data that is associated with it, it is a good idea to do a thorough literature review of the subject, because that will help demonstrate familiarity with the topic and scholarly context and develop a theoretical framework and methodology. You can then define your research problem. You can try to, for example, we have chosen an example about, let's say, effects of social media. So what is the impact of social media on body image among Generation Z? That is our hypothesis state. That is a statement with which we start our literature review. Based on that, we go to the next steps. Now, where can you search? You can search your university's library catalog. You can search on databases like Web of Science. It could be a discovery database like EBSCO. There are different databases that you can search in order to do a literature review. Now, when you search on a database like Web of Science, it is a multidisciplinary database. So you are, you can search for different things under one umbrella, and it also allows you to do an iterative search. Again, a good literature search starts with a top-down approach. So you have a, let me start annotating what I mean by a top-down approach. Starting to annotate. So for example, in this case, Starting to annotate again. So in this case, if you notice, we have a first, so we talk about sustainable development and innovation. That's a very broad topic, right? And we are trying to understand in the publications that we can get. Now, if you notice over here, when I do sustainable development and innovation, I get a lot of, results. If I do only sustainable growth and innovation, I get a smaller set of results. So I have decided to combine both of them and to get a bigger data set. Now, in this case, when we are doing a search on the Wuhan coronavirus, you notice we have chosen as many synonyms as possible. So, stopping to annotate. Again, starting to annotate. So, the first thing in a literature search is make sure you cast your net wide. Use synonyms. Use broader concepts. So for example, if I'm trying to search for waste paper that can be, the example I'm taking here is very simple. I want to search for papers that talk about converting waste paper into a bioalcohol. What I'm actually trying to search for papers that discuss an enzymatic hydrolysis process for the same. Now, when I do a search, I can use synonyms of waste paper, I can use synonyms of the enzymatic hydrolysis process, but at the same time, what we need to do, and we need to be very careful, is what in broadly, what does this particular process talk about? It basically talks about conversion of a complex carbohydrate. Waste paper is nothing but cellulose, which is a complex carbohydrate. So we are talking about breakdown of complex sugars or carbohydrates into some kind of an alcohol. So I have searched. So when I do a search, I can search for apps for exactly the same process, but I can also do some searches for the broader concept. That will make sure that I can get, I can try to understand how have people who are working in a similar field approach the problem. Stopping to annotate now. Now going to the next slide. Now, another thing that Web of Science allows you to do is, because it is a citation database, so doing a literature search on a citation database like Web of Science is very helpful because it allows you to see how are different pieces of literature connected with each other. So you can navigate the citation network to follow a research thread and find different outliers. So maybe we have papers which are talking about graphene. Now, graphene is a very atomically thin, layer of carbon, typically used in catalysis or in lithium batteries or waste material adsorption. But you will also notice if you go to, if you look at the citation connections, there are a few publications that talk about graphene in as a drug delivery vehicle. So this gives you a new idea. Okay, so somebody who is a material scientist and is looking into graphene now can come up with a new hypothesis or now knows that, okay, there are people who are working on this particular application of graphene, which is not that popular. So this using a citation database is perfect for finding publications that are related to each other via the citations that were made. And it is particularly useful when keywords are not easy to define. This is especially important for social sciences. In social sciences, there are a certain concept can be defined or explained using several different keywords, and these keywords are not very specific as opposed to, let's say, biological sciences. When I am looking for a particular gene in a disease, I know that gene can only be, there are only certain names that the gene is referred to. It's very specific where you want to trace older research. If there are medical scientists today over here, look at older fundamental research that can be helpful for drug repurposing. When you want to see where a particular research thread leads to. So, I am a material scientist. I'm looking for publications on graphene. I want to see what are the new applications of graphene now. So, using a citation database for literature search would be very, very helpful in that call, a particular perspective. Now, when you are looking at literature related to your subject, because even before you start writing a manuscript, this is the first thing that you will all do is really try to understand the field by doing a thorough literature search. When you are looking at the sources, when you're trying to critically analyze a publication, again, a very, very important uh, you point in writing a scientific manuscript is understanding which particular publication trust or understand their standing in the community. Try to figure out what are the what are the key concepts. What about the theories and the methods and the results and conclusions? How detailed and detailed how does it relate to other studies? Is this paper being, cited by other key insights and arguments? Are there limitations to the research? Many journals today, especially I can say about biomedical sciences, they actually publish limitations of the study. They are required to. Journals like Science Translational Medicine, they have a field called limitations of the study, so as to tell the researchers that this is something which is a limitation, and when you refer to this study, you must keep that limitation in mind before, you know, um, using these results to inform any other ideas. So if it is a study which has been shown some very promising results, but it has been done only in an in vitro cell line as opposed to doing the study in animals or humans, that is a limitation. Maybe this is a primary research clear. But been at the sample size of the population, it was low, or maybe we were looking at a population. So maybe this is a study when, if you remember, in the previous slides, we're talking about social media body image in Generation Z. Now, let's say in this study, we have actually interviewed a lot of young, you know, people and ask them how does social media affect their perceptions about their bodies. But we have looked at only we have looked at only people who are coming in from, let's say, the North American demographic. Okay, so that is a limitation of study because there are cultural differences across the world. With the ideas or the views expressed by this particular survey and the insights that we have gained from the survey need not always necessarily translate to other geographies. So that is a limitation that has to be mentioned. If it is not mentioned, this is, as a reader, you need to critically analyze, okay, what are the weaknesses of the study? What are the strengths of the study? With this, we go to actually understanding how do I write a paper. So what are some of the major techniques in scientific writing? The first is what we call the definition method. Definition is typically scientific method, writing technique used in, let's say, it's a descriptive technique. So when you try to define a new species or a new genus, you are describing a certain phenomenon. You are not trying to. So when you write such a publication, the introduction, where you introduce the background of the study, you might try to say that, we were working on this and we found this new, let's say fungus, and we have characterized it. There cannot be, there will not be a section on addressing gaps in literature. There is no compare and contrast. A compare and contrast kind of a paper is typically there in application sciences. People have been working on a certain technique to solve a certain problem, but it doesn't still address these XYZ, issues. We are our technique is able to address issue number X. So, how is your research better than the previous research, or how does it add on to the previous body of research by introducing something new? That would be the compare and contrast method. Enumeration and illustration is very similar to definition. Cause and effect is something which we see a lot in physical sciences and biomedical sciences. When we try to explain a phenomenon, what is the cause of the phenomenon, what is the effect of the same phenomenon. Now, let us try to understand the characteristics of a good paper. We have already talked about that it has to be. Now, in this case, I'm not talking about a literature review. We have talked a lot about, how do you do a literature search? How do you write a review paper? A good review paper is one that critically analyzes the entire literature space, the domain, and offers critical insights to the reader. It is just not a laundry list of papers. Okay, so these are, so let's say you're writing on electric vehicles and its effect on reducing pollution. It is just not that, X has done this, Y has done this. It is when you talk about that, we have found that this is what happens. You're offering something more than what was already there in each of the individual papers. You're synthesizing, critically analyzing, and offering what is known in the field. How can that affect future research? You are offering a critical opinion. That is, the opinion needs to be objective. Remember, we talked about objectivity of science. It has to be bolstered by what is already known. So maybe when you talk about electric vehicles and you say that though electric vehicles are being promoted, maybe in a certain in these countries it has not really led to a reduction in emissions. Why? So what? So then you make this point by saying that this is it has not made a reduction in emissions. We know from these papers, from these studies, and what needs to be done. How can we better use electric vehicles? Or why are electric vehicles maybe not so popular in certain areas? What are the deficiencies? So you are offering a critical opinion, which is objective. It is not an opinion that is subjective. It is an objective opinion based on evidence from previous studies and literature. That is the hallmark of a good review. Now, so this is something I love to quote. There are two reviews called Hallmarks of Cancer. Many of you who do not come from a biomedical field might not be, cognizant, but these are very two nice publications, and I really urge you to have a look at them, even if you are not from the field. Now, what the scientists have done over there, the authors, they have basically looked at the evidence of the different processes that contribute to cancer in humans, and they have tried to understand, and they have categorized these processes into broad, physiological definitions, and say that these are the hallmarks. These are what always will happen in a tissue that is turning cancerous. So what they have done is they've synthesized they synthesize a huge body of literature to come up with 7 signs or 7 definitive things that happen in cancer. And that is what makes those reviews extremely important to any cancer biologist or scientist, because it tells them for the first time, it has synthesized such a huge body of literature and has brought all that disparate information together. So this is how a good review article looks like, what you need to do. The characteristics of a good report in terms of it being an original research article is that the results need to be original in the sense that they should not be replicating other research. Another thing, and this is something which I cannot emphasize enough, is a good research article, especially a good original research article that has original data in it. It should allow people, peers, to repeat the reported experiments or run the code. It does not mean that the results need to be same. So I remember in terms of social sciences, we talked about Generation Z and body image and social media. If it's a well-formulated questionnaire that was used for the survey and it was a well-formulated study, that those study points, that particular questionnaire can be tweaked and used in other geographies. Another thing is that it should be published in a public source document and available to the scientific community. That goes without saying. It is the duty or the obligation of a scientist to make a timely report of the work. So if you remember, when the pandemic hit around 3.5 years ago, by late 2019, early 2020, scientists had started generating a lot of information about what did the virus look like, what did the SARS-CoV-2 virus look like, what were the different domains in the virus that could be used for drug targets, what was the genetic makeup, why were they, and they were publishing it immediately because that was needed. Everything that they were working on was needed in the public domain because that was the work that was used by scientists in drug companies in translational settings to actually develop medications and vaccines that helped us combat the disease. So just think about it, if they were working on it and they had decided that we will not publish. That's the reason a lot of this work was actually published as preprints, just to make it sure that it was reaching the public. So again, a characteristic of a good paper is timely publication and availability to the scientific community. Now let us evaluate. Before we even start with a paper, you need to evaluate your research. Have you done something new and interesting? Check mark 1. What it means is that, is your work contributing to something which is not there in the previous studies? Because that is something very important for the editor. This is what the editors will look at before they decide to even go about publishing it. Have you checked the latest results in the field? Very important. If you're reinventing the wheel, you'll get a rejection. Have your findings been verified by appropriate analysis and the significance verified? Make sure that the experimental design, the methods, they are valid and reliable, and they're what your limitation. As I said, if your findings are not enough to tell a nice story, maybe you can publish some part of the work as a conference proceeding. If all your answers are yes, then you can start preparing your manuscript. Now, the point number 7 is a work directly related to a current hot topic. This is for judging the interests in your work by editors. If it is on something which is of not of interest to the community right now, you can find it very difficult to publish. Remember, it is not only important for you to have enough experimental data or the study to be well designed, it also needs to appeal to the scientific community at large. What type of manuscript? Is it a full-length methodology research that is for original articles? If you remember in point number 6, if you do not have enough material, if you cannot flesh out your results into a complete full-length methodology research, maybe a smaller communication, a conference proceeding, or a case report may be, good enough. Always ask your supervisors and colleagues for advice on manuscript type. It always helps to get peer judgment and objective, clear peer judgment, because sometimes as researchers, as people who are very intimately working on a project, we tend to think, it's our baby. We try to think that this project is very important. It is everything, right? I mean, we have not done anything wrong. We cannot do anything wrong. But it always makes sense for somebody who is not associated with the project to have a clear, you know, a view on it, because they can all give a good third eye view on it. Next is, before understanding where should I publish, how should you have to decide who is the audience. Do you want to reach specialists, multidisciplinary researcher, or this is what will determine your journal choice? Because you will have to adjust information and writing style accordingly. So if you're writing on, if you want to publish in a multidisciplinary journal, and you think that your paper can be read by scientists of other fields too, you need to keep the technical jargon a little bit on the lesser side. You need to define some uncommon terms. If you are going to be publishing in a very niche journal, everybody in that field works. So maybe your introduction can be more shorter. You can go more in detail on the methodology. Whereas in a more multidisciplinary paper, a journal, you will notice a lot of the experimentation data actually is contained in the supplementary field. Journals, even in similar subjects, reach readers with different backgrounds. Now, that is the reason why you should always go to a citation database like Web of Science and see the table of contents. This is the easiest way to see the table of contents of the journal, to see what are the kind of papers that particular journal. So, for example, in a Web of Science, in the area of, management, there are more than 390, almost 400 journals. But each of these journals tackled with a certain very specific area of management. So you, as a researcher, a management researcher, if you are working in a very specific, let's say, um, a kind of a cryptocurrency blockchain technology, which are the management journals that have been publishing articles on them? Okay, what are the topics in blockchain technology that they are writing about? Is this something that I am interested? Is this something? So I know that this particular journal writes on blockchain, but from a supply chain management perspective, where one writes from a cryptocurrency and a finance perspective. What is my who is the audience for my work? Accordingly, I need to choose the journal. Is the readership worldwide or local? Again, very important about when you think about the topic. If you are, let's say, you're a clinician working in India, you are writing and reporting on some kind of a disease that is endemic to tropical areas, to India, to South Asia, maybe it makes more sense to publish in a more local journal. Or maybe you are working in the area of arts and humanities on culture. So it could be something on Southeast Asian studies, or if you are based out of Australia and you're working on issues that affect the Aboriginal population, the indigenous population, there are journals, there are media for dissemination of these very, very niche and specific subjects that appeal to certain demographies and geographies. Now, there are different kinds of formats. For the purpose of today's, presentation, we have taken the most common format, which we call the IMRAD format. Okay, the IMRAD format is something which has a standard format in which, especially scientific research, is reported. Now, if you as far as people, when you talk about the IMRAD format, we talk about a format where you introduce a problem. What are the questions studied? How was it studied? What were the findings? And if you try to understand that, how have people started writing in this format? The first scientific paper in this way originated in 1665, when they actually tried to understand a problem in a very specific way. The scientific paper, it was first published in the French Journal des Savants, and English Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. So they started, systematically publishing research results. And since then, of course, there are different changes that the scientific paper has been. However, from the 19th century, the even before IMRAD as a very specific structure came into being, an overall organization known as theory experiment discussion appeared in original research articles. And gradually, in the course of the past 5 decades, a formally established structure comprising of the introduction, method, results, and discussion, which is called IMRAD, was adopted. Today, the IMRAD format is a standard for scientific writing in most knowledge areas, and you even have the American National Standard for preparation of scientific papers, which was first appeared in 1972 and again in 1979. ANSIZN. Let me just annotate and put that for further reference for all of you. So annotating and using the text tool, ANSI Z39.16, 1972. You can look this up. Very, very interesting. Stopping to annotate. So the IMRAD format provides a consistent framework for answering several questions critical to understanding a scientific study. For example, the introduction tells you why was the study done in the first place? How was the study done exactly in the methods? What were the findings and the results? And what do these findings or results mean after all? And what are the implications? Furthermore, if you write your paper in this modular structure, it helps the author to organize their ideas and remember critical elements. And it allows the editor and the reviewer who are evaluating the manuscripts to evaluate them easily, and improves the efficiency of the scientific reader to locate specific information without going through the entire paper. Very, very important. So if I want to know about a certain methodology or a statistical test, all I need to do is, go to the materials and methods rather than reading the entire paper. Going to the next slide. So before we go to the IMRAD, we'll just start with the overview of the entire scientific process once again, and we will try to recapitulate what we have learned till date. So when we talk, so again, starting to annotate. So when we talk about hypothesis, this is where your literature search is very important to come up with the hypothesis. So your literature search, this must be done in a systematic way. Manner. Okay. Then we come to the experimental design. This is where you can refer to other people's methods and materials. Once you complete the experiments and the data analysis, if your hypothesis fits in with the experimental results, you can, proceed, or otherwise you revise the hypothesis. Very important. stopping to annotate. Very important. Your experimental design needs to be iterative. You should not ever change your experimental design to fit the hypothesis. You should choose an experimental design that allows you to test the hypothesis, but not. So choose an experimental design to test the hypothesis. But overall, this is an iterative process. Once you have the final results and the hypothesis, you prepare an outline of what you want to report. And this is when you look at those checklists that we talked about. You prepare a draft, you revise a draft, and submit the manuscript. This is the overview of the publication process. And the overview of the entire research process, once you submit, what happens after you submit the manuscript? We'll talk about this in the later parts. There is either a rejection or a revision. You can issue rebuttals at each step to make sure that you can get your paper published. Again, the 10 checklists, very, very careful. We have repeated them before, but I've just added this slide to again recapitulate. Is there a story to tell? What was the rationale for the project? This is what you will, this with this part, what was the rationale for the project is what constitutes your, this is what constitutes your introduction. Did you perform a thorough literature review? If you can find the gaps, if you can, very important so that you have addressed the gaps, you are not publishing similar results. All of these parts, these will depend upon a good literature review. Whether you are able, once you read and refine your literature review, that this is when you should have a clear hypothesis. This is when you will decide that can you your own this part, if you have answers to this part constitutes your materials and methods, and this is what you will use in your discussion. Finally, the first publications or a specific topic always has priority, so make sure that you are not repeating. So if you see, there have been a lot of papers. I'll give you an example again of the coronavirus, COVID-19. The papers in the beginning which address key concepts, they were the papers which were cited, which were really used. So if you have been doing the same work, you are basically reconfirming other people's results. That also has some value, but it doesn't really make your publication very important, and that will decide which journal chooses. So if other people have been working on a similar technology, they have published something substantial before, and you are just another one of you don't get to publish in a very high impact journal. We have already talked about the article structure. Other than the main text, we also have the title, the author, abstract, and keywords. We will discuss about them. Acknowledgements and references. We will talk about acknowledgements, references in term for good citation practices. I have already told you supplementary materials typically constitute of experimentation or materials and methods that do not or fit into the main story. So often when we do a project, we have several different experiments that will support our hypothesis or our idea. But when you are telling a story, you have to be very careful which of these experimentations really fit into the narrative. Not everything needs to be presented as a story. But if you want to put this material out there, because you have done these experiments, you want people to look at those results too, you can put them in the supplementary materials. But when you're writing the main story, the main text, it needs to be concise and crisp. So typically, the best way to write a paper is you start with methods, because this is what will be there in your records, in your journal, how you have actually accomplish something. How did you go about the experimentation? Once you have the methods, you start writing the results, the findings. Once you have the findings, you try to explain how it does it fit into your hypothesis. What implication do these findings have? You already must have done the literature search before, but now once you write the discussion, you will get a better idea of explaining to the community, to the public, the reader, why were you doing the project. And finally, when the entire paper is done, you write the abstract and the title. So let us start first from the introduction and the background section. Now, the introduction is a critical showcase. It explains the scope and the objective of the study in the light of current knowledge on the subject. Every scientific paper, an original article or a review article, a case report, or a letter needs to have an introduction section. It therefore should it, because it is a critical showcase which persuades the reader to read further, it should be relatively short. Typically, many journals recommend it to be less than 500 words, and it should highlight why the author carried out the research, providing the background the reader needs to understand and judge the paper. Specifically, the introduction delineates the nature and the extent of the problem study, connects the study to previous work, usually by a brief review of literature, and explains the objectives of the investigation. You need to define any specialized terms or abbreviations in the introduction itself. The introduction should logically lead to the hypothesis or the principles theme of the paper. So typically the introduction ends with why are you doing the paper? How have you done this? A small showcase of that. And it is advisable to write the introduction. So this is the writing style now. It is always advisable to write the introduction in the present tense, especially when you mention the published data or hypothesis. And this is best written in active voice. What should you not do in the introduction? Now that we have said what you should do, what should you not do? Do not overly state the broad research area. Do not include textbook information or over citation of old research needs to be cited, but do not make. But if you are writing on something which has relevance, contemporary relevance, all your citations in the introduction should not be older research. It can be a combination of both. You can start by citing some really important seminal older papers, but it should not be only older papers. It should have the newest research, because that is where you will be able to show what are the gaps in literature. You should not include identical sentences from the abstract or other sections. It just decreases the readability and the interest of the reader. If the reader, when they're reading, they come across the same sentence structure, it is jarring to the brain. Another thing which is very important is, this is again a good citation practice. Try to include references that are easily discoverable on the web. Now, I do know for certain fields in arts and humanities, you might be compelled to cite some obscure book. That is fine. But as far as possible, in the general terms, and if it is a broad research area, if it's a research area that has a lot of literature in it, try to include references that are easily discoverable and references that at least have some English metadata associated with them. So if it is an absolutely non-English reference that other people cannot, decipher, they cannot discover, it becomes difficult for them to trust your citation. Do not be overtly negative to studies of other groups or emphasize only your studies from your own group or collaborators. The introduction is not somewhere you introduce complex tables or figures. Next, going to the materials and methods section. The materials and methods section describes how a study was conducted. The purpose of this section is to present in a simple and accurate manner what has been done, how and when, along with information about analysis of the data, statistical techniques used, etc. This section must provide all the information needed to allow another researcher to repeat the experiment and replicate the results obtained. Therefore, authors must include as many details as possible in order to allow other researchers to replicate the experiments. Detailed information about design of the experiment with number of replications and sampling procedures used must be included. Standard methods need only be mentioned or may be described by reference to the literature as long as it is available. Just give me a moment. Now, the materials and methods section is typically specific to the journal, and because the authors must include as many details as possible, make sure if you're writing on chemistry, you include even the batch numbers and the grades of the chemicals used, because that will be helpful for other researchers to replicate the experiments. So you need to clearly describe, along with exact technical specifications and quantities, and the source or method of preparation. For example, as I said, for in chemistry, it is preferred to include the manufacturing company's name after the chemical or generic name mentioned. Statistical and mathematical procedures used to analyze and summarize the data must be described clearly. In fact, today several journals make it a note. Even the question that they ask reviewers is the correct statistical process being followed? Now, materials and methods is some place where a lot of researchers face the problem of self-plagiarism. Because let us be clear, there are not that many different ways that you can write a certain process, right? How are you going to describe a Western blotting procedure in molecular biology in different ways, in different, manuscripts? So the best way in that case is, it is not necessary to narrate all the minute details of a process. The authors must ensure that if any changes are being made or anything specific has been done in this particular experiment process, they can always cite an older a paper. So let us say I have taken this particular you know procedure from Smith et al 2018, and you can say and just modified accordingly, and you specifically just write about the modification. If a process is taken as it is from an and it has been reported in any other paper, your own paper, you can just say this process is as described in Nag et al 2013. This section can be placed after discussion section in many journals. And remember, much of this section can also be included in the supplementary data section, especially if you have a lot of experimental processes that you have developed. Maybe it is about some very some new way of generating a transgenic species, and you need to write it in detail so that other people can replicate the experiments. A lot of that can actually go to the supplementary section, because many journals have a limit on what the main text can contain. Writing wise, just like the introduction was supposed to be written in the present tense active voice, this is typically written in the past tense and passive voice. Now going to the results and discussion. This section provides the findings of the study, the results section, and therefore it is the core of the paper. Simply put, that is the most important part of the paper. While the introduction and materials and method sections are designed to explain why and how the authors arrived at what is presented in the results section, the actual scientific merit of the paper depends on this section, and it must be presented in an absolutely clear, concise manner without any ambiguity whatsoever. It is usually easiest to follow the result if they are presented in the same order as the objectives. Very important. How do you, uh, you know, how do you decide the order of your findings? They should be in the way the objectives were. What were you setting to do? Your results should tell the story in the same way. And remember, the discussion should run in parallel to the results. Now, some of the guidelines to providing the results are as follows. You should present the results simply and clearly. Just present the selected data giving the big picture. If you think you have many more findings that add on to the story, you can put them again. As I said, you can put them in the supplementary section. It is not needed to be put in the main text of the paper. Report only representative data and that can and provide sufficient interpretation of the data. Report data in the form of statistically analyzed summaries and present in tables or figures along with essential statistical information to facilitate understanding. Repeat in the text only the most important findings shown in tables and graphs. So results is a very tables and graphs heavy section. Your table and graphs can have many more results, but when you're writing them down in the text, you can only pick and choose from the panels and say, so you can, every panel will be explained in the legend of the table of the figures, and we will come to the figures in a bit. Cite in the text every table and figure by number. Very, very important. Many journals also want you to include negative data if useful for interpreting the results. Avoid verbose or negative expressions. So, for example, it is clearly shown in table 2. Tables and figures are an integral part of a well-written scientific paper, and they typically appear in the results section. There are exceptions, of course. Now, figures show trends and features, while tables are supposed to provide accurate numbers. Okay, and also there is a certain way of writing. A beautiful paper player, thing that you can, I'll just let me just share with you. Just give me a moment. This is an old, um, text, quite old, but I really like. I'm just sharing over here. I'm just putting this over here. Give me a moment. This is a wonderful, wonderful blog which talks about how you write scientifically. And there's an amazing thing, this is by George Gopin. It was published first in 1990, but it has remained a cornerstone about the art of scientific writing. And he tells that there are certain ways, for example, if you're talking about temperature and, if you're talking about degrees, temperature, and different days, having the actual temperature on the right hand side makes more sense. It makes it easier for you to interpret the data. Okay, so for example, if I have time and temperature, so at 0 degrees I'm heating something at 0 degrees. So let me give you an example over here. Please bear with me. Okay, so this is a very classic example. Okay, This is the blog. I hope all of you can just go and search for it. It is on the American Scientist. It is called The Long View, The Science of Scientific Writing. It is by George Gopin. I would really urge all of you to have a look at this particular, so George Gopin. He's the one who has written this blog, very well written, and it tells you exactly how to write up, how. So for example, time and temperature, if you notice, this is the way we typically write it, because this allows, if you had flipped these two columns, temperature over here and time over here, your brain would not have registered, because when we read something, we are very used to looking at the time aspect first. Stopping to annotate. Again, summary, what should you be doing in results? Use figures and tables to summarize the data, show the results of statistical analysis, justify the choice of methods, define the limitation of the methods. When you are writing about the results, the findings, also tell them that these findings are in the context of the experimentation used, and what is the limitation of that particular experimental process. Do not duplicate data, we have already talked about, and use graphics. Graphics and diagrams, general suggestions. Legends should be able to stand alone. Legends should not contain experimental details. No, they should just describe what is there in that particular figure. Now, in general, what are the suggestions for writing the tables? Tables should present exact values and allow comparisons between data points. They should be understood without referring to the text. For diagrams, tables, graphics, they need to be understood without referring to the text. In general, use only one table per 1,000 words of text. Text must refer to the table by number. Captions, as we have said, legends and captions should be concise and contain keywords. Do not include columns, and tables should contain no vertical lines. Typically, no vertical lines. If you notice over here, no vertical lines. Next, we come to the discussion. The discussion is the section where the authors explain the meaning and implications of the results. The sections pull everything together and shows the importance and value of the work, and is therefore the most innovative and difficult part of the paper to write. The author's skill in interpreting the results in the light of known facts and using the results as evidence for the innovation explanation of the observed behavior is supposed to push the frontiers of knowledge and arouse the reader's enthusiasm. Without an engaging discussion, the reader may leave saying, "So what?" Now, what should a good discussion do? It should not repeat, very, very clear. Do not repeat what has already been said in the introduction and the review of literature. It should relate the results, the questions that were set out in the introduction, and show how the results and interpretations agree or do not agree with current knowledge on the subject. It should explain the theoretical background of the observed results and indicate the significance of the results. The discussion also provides you with a platform for suggesting what the future research that is planned or is needed to follow up. You need to also state conclusions with evidence for such. Now, the discussion in terms of writing style, it can be written in both the present and past tense. Current knowledge is stated in present tense, whereas when you report your own findings, that is in past tense. So if I say treatment A was better than treatment B, which suggests that treatment A can cure hormone resistant breast cancer, which is not treatable by XYZ drug. So I am talking about our own results in the past tense. But when I'm talking about what is known, what are the current treatment strategies, I'm talking about that in the present tense. Analytical insight is what we should strive for in the discussion session. And this insight is what it makes a engaging discussion. Okay, you should not just simply state or make superficial statements like this work agrees with author X's work. Okay, because the objective of the research is just not to see if the results agreed with some other author's work, maybe published 20 years ago. Another common problem in the discussion section is the tendency to move away from the stated objectives and try to become too extrapolative. Okay, so do not be very extrapolative. Okay, do not indulge in pedantic discussion and conclusions that do not emanate logically or are not substantiated by the results presented. Okay, so just don't talk about, so you have one drug that showed some effect in a rodent system. That does not make it the next cure for the disease. Let us come now to the abstract. Once you've finished writing the main text of the paper, we discussed about IMRAD. Now we come to the final blocks. Abstract. Indicative abstract, it should outline. Remember, abstract and title is what is searched when you are doing a literature search, either on the internet, Google Scholar, Web of Science, or any other platform. If you want your research to be cited, to come up in other people's searches, your abstract should be very, very precise. It should cover the essence of the paper, right? And you, when you're writing the abstract, also check carefully what is required by the journal of your choice. The quality of an abstract strongly influences the editor's decision. Abstract is precise and honest. It does not use technical jargon and does not cite references. Please do not cite any references in your abstract. What should your title do? A good title should contain the fewest possible words that sufficiently and accurately describe the contents of a manuscript. Keywords are important for indexing. They enable your manuscript to be more easily identified and cited. Check the guide for authors for journal requirements. Now, coming to good citation practices. General suggestion, limit the number of citations to a number consistent with articles published by the journal. For most publications, except reviews, fewer than 50 citations are adequate. For references, please remember, if you're citing some figures, let's say the GDP of a certain country is so and so, include primary sources if possible. Avoid excessive self-citation. Check references for accuracy. Make sure your whatever comment you are making, whatever fact that you're stating in your paper, that is bolstered by your references. If you do not put references to unpublished data in, you can include them in the text. We do not recommend putting a lot of unpublished data as references, but that does not go into a bibliography. Do not cite more than 3 references per statement. For a topic with a large number of possible references, you can cite the original reference and the most recent references on the topic, or 2 comprehensive reviews. Make use of available software to simplify and accurately format and put your references in order. For example, EndNote. Make sure, because one of the top reasons for desk rejection is that. How do you choose the right journal? Use your library resources and tools like Web of Science to identify journals that have published work in your area. Try to understand which amongst them reach your target audience, what about their impact in the field. Commonly used criteria for selecting the journal is the scope of the journal and the reputation of the publisher. Very, very important. Web of Science typically allows you to do a lot of searches to understand, what are the technology trends, which journals are publishing in that area. You can also use scientific visualization software like VOS Viewer to understand what kind of research is being published in a certain journal, right? To make sense of the overarching themes. Now, why Web of Science? We have a very, very strict and rigorous curation matrix for the journal selection that allows us to ensure that we are selecting for you the right kind of journals. And if you're publishing in a Web of Science index journal, it's a global platform. For, if you're publishing in a journal that is indexed on a global platform like Web of Science, it increases the discoverability of your work. Look at journal impact factor. It's a journal impact factor is a citation metric. It tells you the impact of your publications of the in a particular journal. Now, there is a certain note that must be taken. How good a journal impact factor is depends on the subject. Is a journal impact factor of, let's say, 3.45 good or not? You cannot make the decision until and unless you try to understand what is the median citation rate in a particular journal field. Now, there are three scenarios for publication strategy. One, you can publish in just the best journals, or you can publish in more conservative journals which are not that well regarded. But if you notice this is a figure that actually tells you why understanding the citation rate in a field is so important. Now, if I look over here, I've taken two subject areas, oncology and mathematics. Now, in mathematics, it has 300 journals. Oncology has 230 journals on the Web of Science. However, if you notice in for mathematics, the median impact factor is just 0.746. That means 50% of the 300 plus journals have an impact factor less than 0.7. Whereas for oncology, 3.028 is the median. So that is because the citation rates in these two subject areas is very different. Oncology is a more interdisciplinary area. You have lot of more researchers. Mathematics is more niche, fewer researchers publishing in these journals, fewer citations. Again, it's very, very important when you are deciding on a journal, rely on information available on JCR or Web of Science only. There are various misleading similar named indicators available. So if you see a journal website talking about impact factors, etc., please verify that these journals are there on global citation databases like Web of Science. No good journal will ever say indexed in Google Scholar or has an H index. H index is not a journal, specific metric. So key takeaways for our researchers: select the most appropriate influential journals to publish research. Use the appropriate metrics based on your considerations. Very, very careful. Understand the geographic and institutional contribution to a journal's impact factor. Determine your article's contribution to the journal performance and identify related journals. We have already talked about fake impact factors. Be very careful of them because they advertise these fake bogus impact factors in spam emails and on their websites. Finally, in conclusion, look back and think it over before you start writing a paper. Write it in a proper way. Check your paper when you finish it and revise the paper or accept rejection in an ethical way. With that, we finish our webinar, and we hope these small tips will help you in your journey of your research. Thank you so much for your time. We will now stop the recording and we will be taking questions and answers.